controversial subjects with the facts can be tense, but we are a sub-science here to make things make sense.
So we are here with Anna Gifty, and I'm going to read a little bit about you because you are very impressive. An alumni of Harvard University. Okay. You studied mathematics with a minor in economics. You're a researcher, entrepreneur, writer, and speaker, and you're very famous with your work for the Sadie Collective, which is the first and only organization dedicated to addressing the pipeline and pathway problem for Black women in economics and related fields. So we want to talk about that today, plus many other things. So happy to see you, Anna.
Thank you. And let me just make a really quick correction. Excuse me.
Okay.
I actually went to UMBC, so University of Maryland, Baltimore County, but I did spend time at Harvard this past year as a student as well.
Okay.
I did a fellowship program.
We don't want to forget about the prior very famous say that university again, because they need more shout outs.
I said University of Maryland, Baltimore County.
There we go. Also, like, honestly, I mean, we can get right into it, but like this whole like elite university Harvard thing, like, it's so frustrating to me. Yes. Okay. You're saying no.
It's overrated. It's overrated.
Totally.
Honestly. And what you'll find about, I'm not shading Harvard explicitly, but I'm sipping my tea a little bit. Like, what you'll find is that a lot of these institutions are decentralized. And so you have people kind of doing their own thing all over campus. So, even in talking with students who actually go there and get their degree there, like a lot of them, it's really hard for them to find resources and, people to reach out to on campus, even though you would think that, an Ivy League university would have all the resources, all the money, all the experts in the world. In terms of you actually getting connected to it, it's a dub. You won't.
Yeah. And we've done videos also about like, going to these schools where, like, I guess they have elite names and how it's not necessarily going to be a better education for you. It's not necessarily going to be good for your morale to be around all these like type A people. Like
that part.
Yeah. Like,
it's sort of like the little fish in a big pond concept, right, where like you could be like the smartest person, but you go there and then you start to feel like you are no longer the smartest person. And there's there's interesting research about how much research gets published, and people who go to other schools end up publishing more than people who are considered like the top 20 percentile of Harvard. You know what I mean? Because when they're there, they're like, I'm so stupid.
Right. And who's to say that like publishing is any indicative like feature of who you are and the kind of work you can produce? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
like,
that's a weird,
just kind of being in living in Cambridge was like living with a bunch of academics 24/7. And I was like, I don't mess with this like at all. Like who would choose this life, But some people really thrive off of that environment. Yeah.
Wait, so
it is what it is.
So you grew up in Cambridge? Is that what you're saying?
No. Cambridge was Cambridge House is Harvard.
Okay.
Where I was for the year.
Okay.
I grew up in Maryland.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is like, wait, oh my God,
we're Canadians. We don't know geography of America at all.
No. We should know. I definitely feel like I've been near Maryland. So okay, where?
If you've been near DC, right? DC is housed between two states. Virginia, which is crusty, and Maryland. So Maryland is like smaller state, and it has actually way more Black people. It's actually home to like most of the wealthiest like Black folks in the country. So like all of the counties that have, super high, what was I gonna say? GDP per capita for Black people, like Maryland, that's where we are.
Okay.
I don't live in those areas, but like it's there. Yeah.
Well, this is this is you. I feel like we've even in talking to you a bit before we started recording, you're just have your finger on the pulse of economics. Like you're able to talk about. You knew how much money we were getting paid here in Canada for COVID. Like so.
Yeah.
To clarify, not us personally.
I was sad.
Yeah.
I was sad.
So we know nothing about economics. Okay, this is not a strong point for us, but I would love for you to talk about how you got interested in it, because I don't know, I've never really been interested in it. Like, where did this seed of knowledge start for you?
Wow, that's a great question. So let me just define what I think economics is.
Okay, yes,
some people might come for me, but it is what it is. So essentially economics is sort of the study of kind of looking at how do you maximize limited resources. And honestly, like that definition actually can change depending on sort of the perspective you're looking at it. So most people don't like this sort of maximization definition just because it kind of like feeds into capitalism and that sort of thing. And obviously like white men have been able to take that and exploit everybody. So like there's different ways to think about economics, but I'm still a student of economics, so I'm still learning alongside y'all. But what I will say about my journey into economics, it actually begins with biology.
Yeah. Okay, we bow down. We bow down.
You hooked us in.
Yeah.
And how much I hated it.
That was a good.
I'm sorry. I had to pause.
Oh my god. And I oop, yeah.
So what I will say is that I actually spent a lot of my sort of younger years talking with my dad and brother about politics and economics without really knowing what those things were. My brother actually introduced me to The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and I was hooked. So like every day I would tune in. I'm like, man, like, how does he know all this stuff? This is so dope. And then I would also spend a lot of time watching TED Talks. I was that kid who watched TED Talks and then also watched Gossip Girl in the evenings, right? So like that was sort of like my schedule throughout the day.
Your verse.
And so, exactly. And so essentially, when I got to college, however, like I am a child of African immigrants, specifically from Ghana. And a lot of African immigrants believe that there's only 3 career choices: lawyer, engineer, doctor. There's nothing else in the sphere of career choices. The idea of even being like a YouTuber or influencer is not even here. So for me, when I entered college, initially I entered college as a business major, and then I transferred and then became a biology major, where I spent about a year and a half in that. The class for me that made me realize that this was not my calling. It wasn't my ministry, was organic chemistry.
Okay.
Actually, I spent quite a bit of time as a pre-med bio person, like watching ASAP Science videos and like trying to find concepts that were going to be on my test on y'all's videos. I'm like, okay, they add, some interesting things to it, and there's some pictures I can kind of follow. I'm a visual learner. So I was very deliberate. And so I was like, maybe there's other ASAP Science-y type things out there that get into like, what a monomer is. I don't even know what the word is anymore, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, monomer. Yeah.
Thank you. And so for me, organic chemistry was just really painful. I spent so much time studying and it just didn't work. Like I definitely got that C, and I'm proud of that C because it showed that I did my best. But the other class for me at the same time that I was taking was cell biology. And at some point, my professor was talking about signal transduction. And I literally was sitting like this, and I was like, wow, I don't care about this. This is so horrible. But like simultaneously, I had just been introduced to research, biomedical research in particular. And I was like, this is actually kind of dope. I like the idea of asking questions, but the kind of questions I want to ask are a little bit bigger than the cellular level. And I definitely appreciate this. And so somebody in the lab actually put me on a data project. And I was like, oh, y'all collect data and analyze it. Okay, maybe like I need to change my major. And this was like, I had maybe 8 classes left in my major. My mom was like, you're throwing your life away. What are you doing? And I was like, okay, I think I should change my major to math. And so I changed my major to math on a whim. And literally within 2 weeks, I fell into this thing called economics. I was introduced through a variety of different conversations, and pretty much for me kind of married my interest in math and my like deep desire to understand social issues in a really sort of intuitive way. So that's sort of how I got into economics.
Wow, that's
really
fascinating.
cool.
That was really long.
No, but it's
all.
so interesting. And I don't know, like the zooming out sort of thing. What were you going to say?
Yeah, just that it's an interesting way to connect the dots around. Like I've never thought of economics through like social constructs in that way, because my natural instinct is biology, and I'm like, how can I connect biology to those social constructs? It's just interesting to be like, yes, everyone can come at these challenges that we all face as humans from those different angles, and that's really cool.
And I also, I just want to say, like, I have such a judgment of economics, and I honestly think it's just because I think white straight dudes sucking the life out of humanity. Like that's my instinct, and I'm curious, like, I don't know. Like, I want you to change my mind on this. And you already sort of have, and just their way of talking about it. Like, I think a lot of my life is spent obsessing about science, believing in like socialist structures and then being like against economics because I assume it's innately like bad. But then I know deep down it's like makes everything function. And so I'm just curious how you sort of like, navigate all of that. And I'm also curious, obviously, about the Sadie Collective. And I don't know, maybe that can all connect.
We'll get to it.
Okay.
Let's have this conversation.
Okay, yeah.
I think your read on economics is accurate. It is white. It is male, specifically cis male, right? You have, individuals who don't understand intersectionality and power in the economics profession. And that has been a huge problem for a very, very long time. I think a lot of people, when they look at economics, what they really think about is Wall Street, finance, banking. That's a very, very, very small part of economics. But of course, that's tied to some really big institutions that kind of rule the rest of us, right? When the 2008 financial crisis came crashing down, all of us were affected. And it's really because some white guys made some really bad decisions, and we're including Black and brown folk in the room. And so when we talk about, what economics is, again, it's this sort of big idea of like, I'm trying to understand how the world functions using sort of analytical tools to pull out data that can tell a story about how we can make the world better. And that applies to everything. So I'm gonna give you a couple fields that economists kind of sit in. So economists can, work with public health officials. They can study teacher behavior. They can study student outcomes. One of my favorite studies is an economist that I know, Dr. Dania Francis. Shout out to Dania.
Hi. Hi, Dania.
Hi, Dania. Essentially, it's a study that shows that counselors in high schools actually have bias against Black women when it comes to AP calculus. They don't recommend them holding everything else equal. And so that's actually empirical evidence that could, point to like, okay, well, these counselors are clearly racist and sexist. How do we go about adding mechanisms that prevent them from, keeping Black girls out of pursuing math at a higher level within high school, right? So when we talk about economics being applied to everything, there are economists that study sex work. There are economists who study your phone. The person the organization, that hires the most economists, we don't mess with them, but Amazon, right? Amazon hires a lot of economists to just kind of figure out the marketplace and how do you go about making decisions. And so when you think about what economists do and who they affect, they do a lot and they affect everyone. And so it's really important for the field itself to be as diverse as possible, given just sort of the ramifications that can happen if it's not diverse.
Wow. Okay. I have two questions. One,
Sure.
Does economics always have to involve money, or is it just data? Because when you're talking about that calculus research, I'm like, there's not necessarily money intertwined with this. So is it actually just a study of data?
To some degree it is, right? And it depends on the type of economist you are. So there's some economists who just look at the models and are trying to develop theories that can be then used and applied with data. And then there's most economists are actually more applied, which means that they take the data that they collect from some field study, or perhaps they get administrative data that's available through the US Census. By the way, fill out the US Census form for those listening.
Yes, do that. Oh my God.
That's really important data.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Is it mandatory, or is it?
I don't know if it's mandatory, but I do know that you could probably ignore it if you wanted to. Like, please don't. Yeah. So
okay. Gotcha.
That kind of data is used by economists and social scientists more broadly to make recommendations on who should get jobs, why they should get those jobs, the financial market and that sort of thing. So again, I think when you kind of boiled it down to the bare bones, it's really the study of how do we use data to understand social issues that are happening right now.
Okay, well, now I like economics.
Well, it reminds me, like, one of the recent episodes, we just recorded an episode on, like, sibling order that will be out by the time this podcast, we haven't released it out yet, but it will be out by the time this comes out. And it was an economist who was studying, like, the implication of, if you're the firstborn, secondborn, thirdborn, fourthborn, how that impacts, like, your education outcome, your, like, the salaries you make outcome. And it's interesting. Yeah. I hadn't really stopped and thought, like, oh, that was an economist who was trying to understand the disparities between, like, what your birth order is and how that implicates your future. And that isn't like, you're right. Like, I often think of money, but when you look at it this way, it's kind of like, what is the long-term implication of this, and is that good or bad? And if it's bad or we're not sure, should we change that?
So then there must be a big overlap between economists and science and social science, because some of the things you're saying are making me think of social science. So
Yes.
is economics social science? I'm just like...
We're learning a lot.
Oh my God.
So economics is an interesting, so just to answer your question really quick, so you don't need to involve money to talk about economics, right? As you know, as it was just mentioned, like you can study sort of sibling order, why people text certain way, like there's so many things you can do. The idea is that economics provides you this really nice toolkit that allows you to apply it to a lot of different things. And quite literally anything you really can think of that can be measured with respect to data and analysis is like, sort of fair game in economics. With respect to your last question, yes, economics is social science. It's also STEM, according to the National Science Foundation, which is kind of interesting. When you say that to people, they're like, that's not what the E stands for. You're right. But economics to some degree is so mathematical and statistical that I think NSF actually considers it STEM. But it is more so a social science, and it does overlap with a lot of different fields. The gag is, though, economists don't like to cite other folks. They only like to cite economists. And I think that comes down to, honestly, folks thinking that their toolkit is the best toolkit and they can't, pull from other disciplines. Quite frankly, I think economists work really well. Ideally, they would work really well with sociologists, depending on what the topic is, epidemiologists, right? So you had a lot of economists in the New York Times and other, outlets recently saying like, I'm suddenly an epidemiologist because I know how to use this data. And epidemiologists were like, no, baby, like that's not your field. And you should cite those who actually are specialized in it. So I think, again, my qualm with economics is that it's not sort of embracing of different perspectives, both within it and outside of it. And so, yeah, it is a social science, just to answer your question.
Whoa, my mind's kind of being blown.
Yeah, because that's also
Really?
Yes, no, it is. I'm just so ignorant, and I'm always like, I like Wall Street, like Wall Street, and I'm like, oh my God, it's like they're actually studying all the stuff that I'm so interested in and need to know. Yeah,
because all these constructs help to decide how our societies function, right? But it's so interesting that you mentioned that it's almost like you have talked about intersectionality within economics, but almost now even like intersectionality with other fields, because that diversity of perspectives from like different fields as well can bring so much to each of them.
So we have done a lot of research about how important diversity, gender, sexuality, race in science is to actually create effective, interesting, well-researched science. So like one study we always talk about, it's like a really interesting study where they just look at the last names of different people who have written scientific papers. And the more diverse those last names are, the more likely those papers are to be cited. And as you said earlier, that doesn't necessarily mean like cited isn't necessarily good. But if we're under the assumption that more likely a paper will be cited if it's doing something interesting or worth citing.
Yeah.
It's just a simple way. Honestly, an economist maybe did this study now that I'm thinking about what economics is. Large data sets, it's just so clear why in the sciences you need diverse perspectives in order for it to flourish. Thinking of economics, what is it like when it comes to diversity? What are the issues? Like, I can only imagine, and but I'm just saying I've had a lot of assumptions about it that I've already been torn down a bit. So I want to hear what you would say.
Yeah, so I'll tell you guys a story. When I decided to become a math major and then eventually pick up economics, I had the opportunity to go to a conference for the first time. It's the largest conference of economists like ever. Essentially, it's like thousands of economists will come somewhere for like a week or a weekend rather, and then, they'll convene or whatever. It was kind of like a high school reunion, but, like if you're new, it's kind of like, oh, what's going on? Like, what are these dynamics? But anyway, I had an opportunity to go to the Nobel laureate lunch. So for those who don't know, one of the Nobels that are available, but it's not an official Nobel, quite frankly, it's like a subsidiary Nobel, but like it's Nobel. Off Nobel, thank you. Nobel laureate of economics. And so they celebrate whoever wins that the previous year during this conference. And so I went And I went to the luncheon mainly for the food because conferences don't be feeding you. And so I was like, free food, whatever. I went in and I was really excited. And then the high table walked in. And I was like, it's looking a little beige because what is going on? And it was just like, it was like a dash of brown. I think it was an Indian guy or somebody from Southeast Asia. And I was just kind of like, this is quite interesting. And then I was like, let me just take a quick swivel around the room and see like what we're dealing with here. And so I looked around and I was like, wow, this room is white. It's a lot of white guys. And I was like, like if I didn't have support system that I have currently, I would have been dissuaded by the room entirely. Like, and the unfortunate thing is that room is sort of I would say a metaphor for what is happening in the profession largely, right? I don't know if I used that word correctly.
Yeah, no, I think you did.
Y'all got it. And so like you have a lot of economists who are white, male, many times privileged in some sense. And so, like it's discouraging when you think about the statistics that comes along with sort of the lack of diversity in economics currently. So for example, about 1,197 folks graduated with an economics PhD last year. Go ahead and guess how many of them were Black women. You might already know just because you researched it.
No, we didn't research it.
I'm scared
just throw a
to
number
guess.
out there.
Out of 1,100, it said?
That's also
it's about 1,200.
Okay.
That's a low number, but you said for PhDs. 50, 100.
5.
Oh,
I was
my
going to say
God.
100 as well. Oh my God.
Okay.
That's crazy.
So that's less than half of 1%. It's about 0.4%.
Wow.
And the numbers aren't great for undergrads either, which I think oftentimes people look to that as like, this is the pipeline. Well, the pipeline is trash, right? You have like 2% of economics majors are Black women. And so what is going on, right? Because Black men are actually not facing the same sort of disparity in a sense. Like, yes, they are still significantly underrepresented, but at least at the undergraduate level, like Dr. Rhonda V. Sharp, who's done some work on this, found that within a decade period, the percentage growth of Black men majoring in economics at the undergraduate level at HBCU, so historically Black colleges and universities, grew by about 42%.
Oh, wow.
Actually, I think it was all universities, 42% or so. For Black women, it was 1%.
Wow.
So it's kind of like, okay, so what's going on? Like, are y'all like, and so when you, like, interestingly enough, like the American Economic Association, which looks over like all of the economists essentially, and it puts on this big conference, did a survey, right? They have been in the news up and down because, somebody came out with a paper that showed that, there was this, like, I don't want to say their names, but like, this anonymous form that was, saying all these things about women and, minorities or whatever. And, like that went viral when somebody reported on it in the New York Times. And so economics had to actually like address it. It was actually in the heat of Me Too. And so I think what's happening is that economics oftentimes kind of moves with the societal changes that are happening. But
That's
the issue with that is, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was like, that's kind of interesting that that economics is like fluidly moving with society while
It's
simultaneously
fluid,
trying
exactly.
to study it, kind of. Yeah.
And that's the thing. So like my thing about economics is that it's too important of a discipline for it not to be diverse. And so let me go ahead and just give you an example. So y'all remember the 2008 financial crisis, right? Everybody was broke for the most part. Wall Street was on fire, essentially. And so there was like house foreclosures. So people were like losing their homes. People were getting bad loans given to them, that sort of thing. The thing about the financial crisis is that about a couple years before 2008, all of those things that were happening to everybody was happening to Black and brown communities, like ridiculously. And so Black and brown economists are looking at it like, yo, do you guys see what's going on with our communities? Like, can we address this? I think this is indicative of something that's about to happen. And when I tell you that it was not discussed at like the highest levels of people making economic policy around sort of how do we move, how do we manage the US economy so that it's beneficial for folks? Everybody ignored it for the most part. Until 2008, everything hit. What ended up happening is that during the period after 2008, Black women ended up losing the most jobs out of everybody. And currently what's happening right now with COVID-19 is Black women, again, are losing a lot of jobs. I think at this point, Black women unemployment rate is at 16%. That's horrible, right? You have a lot of like Black adults who are out of a job. Black women in particular are really important to the communities because over 70% of Black mothers in particular are breadwinners in their houses. So if they lose their jobs, you have just now, like, I'm not going to say like taken out in a community, but essentially you are putting a lot of communities at risk. And so it's really important that, you know, if you want to have an inclusive economy that really sort of centers everybody, that you are really kind of prioritizing these voices, these Black and brown voices that have been saying a lot for a long time, but people have not been paying attention to them.
Wow, that's mind-blowing, because it's like, I'm relating it to science, because it's like I see how important it is to have diverse voices in science, because science, obviously in our opinion, is extremely important. But then hearing, I mean, it's just like we've lived so viscerally within this system of like finances and capitalism, and yes, as much as I can be like, I don't like it, I don't know anything about it,
right,
like
right.
it's, I know how it just really is governing all of our lives. And so to think that now, realizing like how important diversity is in that world to actually stop things like the 2008 financial crisis, to stop things like the economic disparities we're feeling now, it's more making me just think, like, I'm totally going back to the beginning of this, right? I'm like, I'm now so...
You're an economist now.
No. Like, I'm just so, like, it's almost like I've been, like, hit with how important these things are. Yes. And I feel so ignorant. And it's like, because
it feels like it's almost a self-perpetuating system where like you don't want to partake in it because it's a system that looks and does benefit like certain types of people, rich white dudes, but then you realize the only way to actually change it is to partake in that system. You know what I mean? Like,
it's like, it's actually like sort of, it's that's why I can only really say like blowing my mind, because it's making me realize that if I keep my back up, or I just keep getting frustrated about this thing, which is Wall Street, which isn't fair, because I'm like, okay, there's so much more. But still, even just like not being in school, me and Mitch are always like, you know, I did art and science. We essentially are always like, we don't know anything about business, and like kind of almost like wear it as like, not like a badge of honor, but sometimes I'm like, yeah, I'm not interested because it's like capitalist and blah. But it's like, wait, no, if you don't address and talk about the things you're talking about, we're just sitting back and leaving this system in the hands of these people who, without this diversity, are actually making horrible decisions, aren't listening to people in order to like avoid something like the 2008 financial crisis. That story is fascinating. And I'm like, how have I never heard it before? As someone who tries to read like diverse things, like, oh my God. And so I don't know, I guess I'm now trying to think, what do you think are the best ways? And this is a really tough question because we're thinking about it right now with science, but what are the best ways to make these systems more diverse, in your opinion? You can say your opinion, but it doesn't have to be like the right answer, obviously, because like everyone has their own sort of version. But I'm curious, like already you have blown my mind enough that I'm just like, what would you think would be the best thing to do?
Yeah, you know, you asked a question that I think is twofold in a sense. So I think there's the, you know, actual changing of economic systems so they're beneficial to everybody. Mm-hmm. And so with regards to that, I would say there's an idea that Janelle Jones, who's the managing policy director, at a place called Groundwork Collective, coined, called Black Women Best. And it's this idea that if you actually center economic policies on Black women and bettering them, everybody gets benefited because they are essentially the most marginalized group. We are essentially the most marginalized group. So if you go ahead and you center economic policies and sort of recovery efforts on Black women, everybody's alleviated as a result. And if you think about it, Black women face a lot of, you know, issues with rent, right? So all of the evictions that are happening right now are going to disproportionately impact Black mothers, especially those who are single mothers. And then if you think about sort of the different sort of opportunities that come along with small business funding, a lot of the minority entrepreneurs in the United States are Black women. And so again, if you were just shooting for Black women, you might just get everybody. And so I think that's like one really tangible sort of economic policy that thankfully is getting a little bit more press now, and hopefully will make its way to, you know, ranks of power that can really start to critically examine whether or not that would be something that they could actually put into practice over the next few months. And I actually even wrote an article about, like, if we don't do this, I'm not sure what kind of economy we're going to have at the end of this, because you cannot afford to have Black women lose all of their jobs. Black women make up the majority of the Black working population in the United States. You can't afford to ignore this group. And if you do, everybody's going to be, hurt and in pain, I guess. I don't know. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just not going to be beneficial.
Wow.
In terms of diversifying the actual, economic system in terms of like discipline and the professions.
I know, I'm sorry. That's such a tough question.
No, it's okay.
Yeah.
No, it's just a question that I'm like, it just really boils down to commitment, right? And admitting that you don't know all the answers. I definitely don't know all the answers. I try to approach things as, like, I'm still a student, I'm still learning. But you have a lot of white folks and non-Black folks more generally that assume that they're better allies than they are, right? They say, well, I have one Black friend that I met at Harvard, and so I'm done. And it's like, no, Susan, you're not, right? Like, what you need to do is you are in a position of power. You're cited, people respect you. You need to take that power and privilege and ensure that the Black folks around your workplace get that same access to power and privilege. I think I broke it down on Twitter in a thread recently about, racism is just a question of power. Who has power and who has access to it? And if you are not willing to dismantle the system that has allowed white people in particular to have power for quite some time, you are complicit, period, right? And I think people don't like to admit that like, oh, like, I'm not a racist. It's not a personality trait. It's about, are you participating in a system that is exclusionary of, marginalized groups? And you have to grapple with that within yourself before you kind of go out and say, I'm an advocate for diversity and inclusion. No, you're not if you are only hiring one Black person in your entire organization per year, right? I've heard of a lot of economists and social scientists more broadly who study sort of issues along the lines of race and discrimination and bias. And then you look at their co-authors, you look at who they work with, you look at who they're training. They don't look like me.
Wow.
What are you doing?
Yeah. No.
You know what I'm saying?
One thing I want to say at the top that's funny is just like how we started by being like an alumni of Harvard, then since I've just gone on to fully drag Harvard this whole entire time.
Harvard is fine,
Yeah.
so they don't come for me.
Yeah,
But like,
yeah, true.
There's obviously issues. Yeah.
But no, that is so fascinating, and I think like it is so true, and I think this is a really important time, and for that discourse to be happening, and I really hope that it continues to happen. Yeah, go.
I was just gonna bring up, like, it's a really interesting discussion around like power as the theme here, because I can even see some relation to right now in politics. Like I feel a lot of scientists in particular being like, hey, we need to engage with politics. Like I think in general people are like, oh, I want to be a scientist, not a politician. But now we're realizing like when we don't have scientists in politics, then it causes problems. And I think I'm just like speaking out loud here, so just like bear with me as I like put this thought together. Problem. But it's like it feels like the people that need to be lifted up the most are often the ones who are not even hunting for power, like the most giving people, like Black women holding their community together. People who crave to be scientists, who want to like do good for the world innately, are not power hungry innately, I think. And it's like, how do we create a system that can benefit the people who are not like wanting to abuse power, but giving them, like putting them in the positions of power because they're the most likely to be like generous with their power at the end of the day. But it is like, it's almost a catch-22 because it's like those people aren't necessarily craving or chasing power, if you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
And then the people who are the ones who are like not going to be equitable with their power in the first place.
That part, you got it. And I think that honestly, science is inherently political, right? If we think about science, let's go in history. The Tuskegee experiment, and many, many other things that happened to Black and brown folk at the hands of, white
like
scientists,
science,
right? And non-Black scientists. And it's kind of like, okay, like, yes, you can. And I think that's something that a lot of my friends who are also in the sort of natural science, physical science space are like, a lot of my PIs are like saying if I bring up certain things, it's racist, yada, 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 right? You cannot separate science and identity. You know, a lot of times our identity informs the kind of questions that we ask.
Mm-hmm.
And science is really about you trying to answer questions using a specific type of methodology. And so you can't say that science, I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but I'm saying, you know, like in general, people can't say that science is divorced from politics. And I would argue that because people have viewed it like that, that's why our politics looks the way it does. Climate change is still up for debate. Huh? What is that? Why is it up for debate? Do people not know what's going on? You know what I'm saying?
It's so,
open your eyes.
Yeah, no, I think this is so like, thank you for saying that, because this is something that we have really had to grapple with for a while.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's interesting. It's also a science, like we should speak mostly from the lens that we know, which is science communication. Also, I want to shout out your Twitter at Anna. Is it at Anna Gifty? That's it?
No, it's Afronomics.
Oh yeah, okay. It's Afronomics because it's just also like you've mentioned your Twitter and already I'm like your Twitter's freaking amazing. Yeah, so go. I was gonna say subscribe, a YouTuber vibe, follow. But in the world of science communication, we have had to deal with this because a lot of people are they're like, we will not talk about politics because science isn't political, or they think they're gonna like lose. There's just this really strong discourse of not even scientists, these are science communicators saying we are not political. And it's so frustrating because of everything you said. And I've been, I just finished a book about immigration, very fascinating book. But what she literally lays out is that the first time that science was ever really accepted was by Carl Linnaeus, full-on racist, disgusting fuck. He was the first, it was the first time that the King of France decided to allow science to exist as something outside of religion. And all he essentially did was just list like full white supremacy. He was like, white people are a separate species, they're good. Then you have the people from Asia, they're bad. You have the people from the Americas, they're bad. You have the black people, they're bad. It's literally, science was created. It was a racist ideology that was created at a time, and it was the first time we ever were allowed to listen to something that wasn't religion in the Western view of things. So it's like, the literal birth of science is political and it's racist. And so it's like, it's really sad, but it's like, but it makes you realize like now, like, I just think before, I think when people would tell us like, we're not political, it would bother us, but we weren't really sure why. And with everything happening, it's starting, and like what you just said, it's starting to be like, are you kidding me? Climate change is a very obvious example where it's like we can no longer allow people, like you said, scientists to say we aren't political. And hopefully with time, with a lot of things we're talking about now, it's about, you know, the fluid movement of time, things will change and people will be getting into science, even hearing you talk, getting into economics in order to try and change the system. And like, that's the hope that I have. But like, my God, like that's such a good point. Science is political. Economics is obviously political. And if we need the politicians to make these decisions, they need to understand that like they need to represent the people that they are like in their countries. Which brings me to another question. And I'm just hitting you with hard questions. So you're allowed to.
Wait, can I interject before you?
Yes,
okay,
please.
Sorry. So this is to the science communities that are listening to this podcast. Silence is still a decision. If you don't say anything, you still made a decision, right? And I think that is structurally violent to have individuals who follow you and who rely on, who you kind of rely on to sort of keep you going and that sort of thing, that are from, you know, marginalized groups, and then not speak to their experiences at a time when, quite literally, you have the NFL, one of the like problematic organizations, still haven't apologized to Cap, right? Coming out and saying, we messed up. If the NFL is saying we messed up and you did it, I don't know what to tell you, bro. I don't know what to, and that's literally the example. I'm like, no one expected the NFL to be saying, we're going to play the Black national anthem at our games.
Honestly, that is
on
like
Al Gore's internet? Are you kidding me? If you're sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying I will be crediting at its Afronomics at Anna Gifty, but that is such a good way to say it. If the NFL can do it, hun, you can do it, little science YouTuber. Yeah.
Come on. And they probably have more to lose. a lot of their fans are probably racist. Mm-hmm. So, the couple thousand fans of yours that might feel some type of way about you saying something, let them go. Just know that as you say something, as you speak truth to power, people will be attracted to that. So what is lost will be gained in time, but you have to go out and step out for those who are being, marginalized and who have been marginalized for time. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. It's honestly a dark realization for us to see, like, that as science communicators, we've always thought, it's a very progressive field. Like, we're talking about climate change and we're talking about things that are like, talking about equality between people. And then even us, like, being gay was an issue, and us, like, talking about racial issues. It's like, we imagine that it's kind of this world of people that are progressive. And then sometimes you're like, oh my God, it's really not. And I think it's because of people's fear to address those things, and it just compounds upon itself.
You said something really interesting early on that I think also is linked to the science field, to the economics field. Sure. Let economics into STEM, like into the acronym STEM. And it's a little bit about this idea of white men who are told that they know a lot. And it's like, there's something about science where I think you feel like you're studying the world in this like objective way, and you're told, and a lot of these people are so smart that I think it's harder for them to then have to deal with the fact that there's these other things in the world that are really complex that they might have gotten wrong. And I sometimes think that maybe we see that a bit in our community, where it's like, okay, we're trying to like all admit the fact that we were wrong. Like, yeah, okay, we love science, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't admit that we're wrong, which is, I think, harder sometimes for scientists because they have to keep up this veil that they are like almost
so smart.
And you see that, like, that's a big issue with even the culture of it. Like, we always try, and like you definitely do on Twitter, like try and be like funny and cool and be like, you can be like a real person. But a lot of our peers, they actually are like, they don't even talk in a very realistic way sometimes, because it's like, I'm like, it's just like a culture. Like, I feel bad, but sometimes it's like literally that like nerdy like voice thing that like, it's just like, I think it's maybe a little bit hard to admit mistakes in the culture of science. And maybe there's like an interesting way of it's
ironic though, because it really shouldn't, because the whole field of science is being like, oh, we're testing and checking our mistakes and then having people criticize our work, and then we're going to redo it. But you're right. There is, like, even as science communicators, this wall you have to break down for yourself, where it's like, people sometimes think you know everything, and then you start to want to keep that image up, right? Like, even for us, like, if we see fans or someone on the street, like, sometimes the image is like, because we've made all these videos, we just like knew everything. It's like, no, we literally like they're like little projects for us that we make, and then we go find the information. And I think that can be like a trap for a lot of people, where they want to keep up that image that and it leads to that sort of feeling of, I can't admit I'm wrong, because then it breaks the illusion that I'm perfect. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I mean, science does have that problem of white men being the standard, and anybody who deviates from that is not objective. And it's definitely, when you talk about race and you're not a white person or somebody who's far removed from white, like, far removed from like different racial groups, even if you are like a non-Black person, like, what I've noticed is that you have to somehow sort of separate your race and ethnicity from who you are in order to address those things and be like considered objective enough, right?
Wow.
And so there's this idea that, my identity cannot be wrapped up in the science and in the questions and in the research that I pursue. And I think that's wrong. And I think that also comes from a place of pride, right? If you think you know everything, well, then there's nothing left to know.
Yeah, time to die. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, so why are you here, right? And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at, right? Like, I think people who subscribe to that, I already know everything that I know, and, there's nothing left to know or whatever. At this point, then you're just flexing, right? And so who are you doing this for?
Yeah.
And this is something that I mentioned to somebody yesterday. When you are given a position of leadership and responsibility, you have to approach it humbly. There is absolutely no way people are going to be best served if you are coming in with, your whole ego and your whole pride. Like, there's nothing to gain from that if what you are putting forth is just something that is self-serving to you and not serving the community that you're hoping to educate. especially as a science communicator, that's like the essence of science communication.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think you know everything, then who are you talking to? Mm-hmm. Are you in the mirror like, Mayor Bitch from Issa Rae's show, like just kind of rapping at yourself? Like, what are you doing? You have to be talking to somebody. And so this idea of like, you have to learn and that sort of thing. I'll give you an example. Recently, I posted a Twitter thread. Again, we keep referring to Twitter. That's kind of where I'm active, y'all. So again, follow me. It's economics. And I kind of laid out why I thought economics was interesting. Now, granted, I just graduated from college last year. So all I know about economics is what I was taught, which was neoclassical, meaning that like this is traditionally what people learn, but there's certain sort of deviations from that, like heterodox and stratification, which touch on like groups and also different ways of thinking, interdisciplinary. And so I kind of talk about like, it's about this maximization thing that I mentioned before. And people start, I don't agree with this, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, okay, let me not take this personally, because they're not coming from me. They're coming for this overall concept of, profit maximization and how it contributes to capitalism. And so, I was listening to the feedback and I was like, this is actually good, it's like good feedback. And I'm understanding like the different nuances of economic thought. Let me go ahead and attach this to the thread. Let me go ahead and retweet some of these, other thoughts. And, what I didn't realize was that people were watching me do that. Obviously they were, like I'm on Twitter, but, people were like, wow, the way Anna's kind of engaging with the different types of perspectives is like not something I've seen before in the economic space. It's like, it's really an idea. It's really an economic idea at the core of it. This idea of like, if there's a lot of things, a lot of ideas competing against each other, at some point, the best idea will rise to the top. Now, if you're just competing against yourself, how do you know it's the best idea? Know? So like you have to invite critical analysis of what you already know and, admit when you don't know something so that that hole can be filled. But again, that comes from humility. If you are not humble enough to accept criticism and correction and feedback, you were in the wrong industry.
That's so fascinating. And it's so freaking true. And I'm like, I always go like so extra and like whatever. And I don't know I should do this, but I'm like, it makes me like, I truly believe that the world would be a better place under a matriarchy. And it's like, we need to teach boys to like this skill. I think there is something about masculinity that's really about like, it's like you have a powerful stance on something. It's not built in teaching men about humility. And it's like, that is really interesting. So it's like, obviously we know that these industries are dominated, science, economics, by men. It's like, okay, if men are too afraid to like go down the avenue of like giving up their power, then at least you need to understand humility and understand this ability to know that you don't know everything and to know that like a lot of these perspectives, that 2008 financial crisis, if you're listening to Black and brown economists, you maybe would have avoided this like detrimental historical moment.
Literally. And I think we also need to stop rewarding sort of mechanisms that feed into this this power grabbing that especially happens in the academic space, right? So you think about, certain fields won't even acknowledge you unless you've published in top 5 journals or unless you are from an Ivy League university. I'm about to show economics ass just a little bit. And say that there was a paper that recently came out that showed that most of the top 5 economic publications in recent years came from 3 zip codes.
Wow.
Those zip codes are Cambridge, which houses Harvard and MIT, and this sort of organization called the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is a great organization. And shout out to Jim Paterba, who I like. He's awesome. I'm not trying to come for them, but let me go ahead and just cover my bases. And it came from Stanford, and it came from Chicago, specifically UChicago, which has the most Nobel laureates in economics. So you have 3 zip codes contributing to what people consider the creme de la creme of economics research for some folks, right? That's a problem.
Yes.
3 zip codes and all of them are gentrified?
Mm-hmm.
Yikes!
Yeah.
There's a problem here. You know what I'm saying?
It's also go.
No, you can go.
Well, I was going back to what you said, like going about with, we're going to go back to ripping on Harvard, although we do love Harvard. But like, this is something we've been doing research because we're trying to figure out how we check the power up that we're in, which is Silicon Valley. And what on my research, I'm realizing is that it's these people who are only hiring at Google and Facebook because of like MIT or these universities. Yeah. So I'm really curious, and I really am like going to be releasing a video where we're trying to get, I think we need to all know who's building the algorithms that control our world.
Yes.
And so
yes.
There's a pipeline thing where they're saying like it's disgusting the amount of Black people who work in Silicon Valley. It's so low, and 9.7% of graduates in computer engineering in 2019 were Black. But it's like they're not necessarily graduating from MIT. But Google, they're all like jerking each other off, and MIT only hiring people from MIT, and they're still buying into this system that as if those, literally the zip codes you kind of mentioned, as if those zip codes matter when they don't. People are graduating from all over this country, and if you allow those other people in, as we've said throughout this whole podcast, that's going to make things better. So hearing you say that about economics is just mirroring exactly what I think the issue is with Silicon Valley. And so it's like it's all linked.
Yeah. There was this hashtag on Twitter some time ago called Black in the Ivory. It actually became sort of a movement. And I contributed quite a bit to it, actually. And, one thing I said was, you find out that there are organizations and academic institutions that say they can't find Black talent. That's what they always say. Where's the Black talent? I can't find where are they? I'm looking, where are they at? But then you find out they've never recruited from a historically Black college or university, ever. Literally a university with Black talent.
Yeah, it's literally like they're
been there.
They're right there. Yeah.
Or they only go to 3 of them, which, by the way, they're amazing universities. So Howard, Morehouse, and Spelman. But there are plenty other HBCUs across the nation. And you find out they've never touched a single one. And I think it really comes down, again, to people trying to say that my identity is separated from my science. No, it's not, because you are making decisions based on who you want to work with or who you want working for you, based on your identity. You're screening based off the fact that you went to MIT, that, you're a white guy, that, you had this sort of privilege growing up. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to replicate to some degree the experience that you had in the workplace with the people that you hire. Silicon Valley looks the way it does because people don't want to admit that the biases that inform their way of life inform their workplace, quite frankly. And so shout out to Black in AI, Dr. Rediat Abebe, who is one of the co-founders, and Dr. Timna Gebru, who's also the other co-founder, who has done a really good job of like bringing together researchers who are really looking at algorithmic bias and how that's about to affect hiring in a big way, right? You got some white folks coding up, algorithms to detect who's going to be a criminal. And then when you use those same algorithms on NFL players, all of a sudden they're considered criminals. Huh? What was your training set, bro? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no.
What was your training set? You put a bunch of, white people who were who were considered good in the system into whatever set you were training your algorithm on. And then the Black folks you put in are disproportionately associated with crime. Of course, when you put it on some random Black person, it's going to show that they're a criminal. And this again comes back to this idea of you cannot give power cannot be concentrated with one group. It's going to hurt everybody. And I think we're seeing that to some degree right now, where anti-Black racism is being explicitly stated and addressed in a big way. It's, about 4 centuries coming, quite frankly, right? But, we're here now. And so the question is, how are people going to redistribute power? Are people going to redistribute power? And once they do, what are going to be the impacts on the rest of society?
Wow. You are so amazing to talk to. I'm just
thank you.
I'm like, we need to have part 2. We need to have part 3. Like, you're just
really?
Yes, you're so smart. I'm like, we are running out of time and we need to wrap it up. And I'm just like, oh. But like, what, like, we're talking a lot about America. What's economics like around the world? And like, I don't know. I'm just curious, like when you were talking about that Nobel laureate meeting, was that in America or was that the world? Like how is white supremacy being held up through economics on an international scale? Like, I'm just curious because, there's so many other people around the world who might even be listening to this, but be like, oh, does this apply to me or not? Like,
I mean, recently, the Duchess of Sussex and Prince Harry came out and said that, Great Britain needs to right its wrongs. Great Britain has many, many, many wrongs, as does all of Europe, because colonialism and slavery were a thing. And a lot of Black and brown folks around the world live in countries that were probably colonized at some point in time. For example, the country that I was born in, Ghana, was colonized up until 1957 for like a brief period of time. And so when we talk about economics and who has power, white supremacy is all up in that, right? Because, those who have power currently within the economic system, even if we broaden it globally, are white, and the power doesn't really change just because the geography does, right? In Europe, the numbers of Black women graduating with, economics degrees is far lower. I actually don't know the number yet, but it is bad. It's really bad. And so the question of, creating a mechanism that, shifts inequitable structures is really a global thing. It's not concentrated in America, though I will say in economics, American economists have a lot of power and they sort of set the standard for everybody else. And one thing I'll say is, for example, you have a lot of African economists who understand their continent and their countries respectfully. But if you talk about research that's done in Africa, development economics research, and who gets cited, it's not Africans. It's not those who are actually living in those countries. It's white folks who go to those countries for about 2 to 3 months and then use that and come back and say, well, I'm trying to get tenure. Ooh, let me stop.
Wow. No, that's like people in Ghana, for example. Wow. So like right? Economists yeah.
And it happens in science too. Yeah. I remember when I was a pre-med and I was thinking about epidemiology in particular as a field I wanted to go in for grad school. And I went to a global health conference at, an Ivy League university, since we just coming for all of them. And I was in the room and I was like, this room is 40 Shades of Beige for the topic that we're talking about, which is like, how do we talk about malaria in West Africa? Why are you guys looking like, I don't even want to say anything, but like, I was kind of really confused. And again, it's folks who are like, but I'm so well-meaning. I care so much about the world. I care so much about that's fine. But are you working with those on the ground? Are you amplifying those who don't typically get cited because of the color of their skin or their ethnicity or their race or whatever? And this is what makes it a global thing, right? Obviously, America's going through a moment, but everybody else needs to catch up as well, because there's a lot of grappling with white supremacy that needs to happen over, hopefully the rest of our existence that, can really kind of get at the core of amplifying and uplifting Black and brown people. Yeah.
And as you said earlier, and as is fundamentally true, that will help the world. That's actually literally essential. And if we don't do that, just even look at climate change, which we think is the biggest issue of our time. If you don't approach it from the perspective, like you said, with the financial crisis, with environmental racism in mind, you're not going to be able to do it. It's like, it's literally the pinnacle of our ability to survive on this planet is to take down the systems of white supremacy. If you don't do it, truly, as humanity, we're fucked. Like it's true. And it's so important right now that we're having these conversations, because it's actually like, for the first time, I'm starting to be like, I think this could happen. I think we could.
It could.
I think we could do it. Yeah.
And I think it comes down to prioritizing the young generation. I'm going to do a quick,
Yes.
Right. And I think, with the Sadie Collective that I co-founded with my wonderful co-founder, Untitled Chapter, like what we're trying to do is say, okay, we believe that Black women are the future with regards to economics, policy, finance, data science, all of the things in between. And so we are going to work with other young Black women to uplift our community so that we get these opportunities and these resources that will allow us to do this work well and to benefit our communities, that whichever ones we decide to sit in. And I think when we talk about globally speaking, like, for example, I read a Harvard Business Review article some time ago that said in 2050, Africa is going to be home to the largest workforce in the world. Now, if that's the case, why are people ignoring it? You know,
like that's soon. Yeah.
You can't ignore this huge continent that has so much vibrant and intelligent and wonderful young talent. So many young people are in, the continent and in respective countries and communities that are ready and able and excited to change the world, but they're not being given opportunities to do that simply because the economic systems in which they sit in are still being impacted by the colonizers that came there 50 years ago. And you have, for example, Francophone countries still use French currency. Why?
Yeah.
Why is that still a thing? What is going on? And so when we talk about economics permeating every single aspect of life, we literally mean that the way that you live is impacted by economics. And so it's so important that the voices of Black and Brown people are amplified in the profession so that everybody is heard and that the economic systems reflect the needs of those people.
Wow. Oh my God. You've literally made me be like, I want to go back to school and study economics. Have you gone back to Ghana? Like,
Yes.
Where did you go? What city?
Yes. I went to Kumasi, where I'm originally from.
Wow.
And I also always touch base in Accra. That's where the airport is. But yeah, actually going to Ghana really was what inspired me to think about, obviously I think Ghana is a wonderful place. And there's definitely aspects of Ghana that are as developed, if not more developed than the United States. But there were other aspects I was like, man, like this is really a structural issue. And how do you address structural issues? And that was actually when I was in high school. I hadn't even thought about economics as a potential career. And actually going to Ghana as a 16-year-old actually prompted me to explicitly look up African economic development videos on TED. And that's sort of what kind of led me to think, hey, there's a way to use data and stuff. But my parents still want me to become a medical doctor. So I guess I don't do that. But I came back to that when I was deciding to change my major. And honestly, that's what fueled me to think more critically about, how do you better communities? Is this the idea of human capital, which is the idea for me that got me into economics? It's the idea of building skills and knowledge amongst a group of people or an individual. And there are different ways you can do that through economics. And so when I saw that that was something I could do and kind of relating it to my experience in Ghana, I was like, man, it just makes sense.
Nice.
What am I doing? Yeah.
What's Kumasi like? I just finished the book Homegoing by Yak Yasi.
Oh, you got to show my ass. I haven't read that book.
Oh my God, no! Like, no way am I saying that. Like, I
heard it's good though.
Like, absolutely incredible book. But they spend a lot of time in Kumasi, and I'm just like curious. Is it a huge city? Like, what is it like?
Huge. It's huge. Yeah. So Ghana has 200 plus ethnic groups within the actual country, because colonialism just drew lines. It was like, yep, pretty good, but drew it through multiple ethnic groups. And so I shouldn't say 200. I think it's 50 actually. Okay. I'm capping. I think his languages are 200. Excuse me. So for me, Kumasi was just really an amazing experience, and I think for me, and for also African Americans who go back to Ghana, recently they did Year of Return as a campaign to get African Americans in particular to come back to Ghana. It's just so, your identity is solidified. You feel me? You're just like, wow, this is so rich. And it, for me, it was just such an honest experience. I truly embraced it. I, spent time with the kids in my neighborhood. I went out, to the market and I spoke to people and I ate sugarcane, which is delicious. And, just kind of embracing every aspect of it and being like, I can call this place home, and I can, embrace those who still don't know where their lineage comes from and say, this is also home for you if you want it to be. And so I think for me, it was just like a humbling experience. It really grounded me. And it also sort of, I don't know, it was interesting. And Ghana people move this way. I was talking like this in the market with my dad, and some random lady I don't know, and I still don't know to this day, was like, "Can you speak the local language?" And I was like, "No." She was like, "Disappointment," and then walked away. I was like, "Who was that?" And my dad was like, "That's what happens all the time." And I was just kind of like, but it's sort of this comfort level of like, we're family, we're kin, and so I'm gonna go ahead and obviously reach out to you, call you out if I need to, if I need to correct you. It's out of love, ultimately. And I think for me, that was just really, really grounding. So I loved it. Highly recommend. 10 out of 10.
Yeah, because after finishing this book, I was like, I really want to go to Kumasi. Yeah. Obviously, I'd have a very different experience than you.
Make sure you go with the Ghanaian tour guide when you arrive, because they'll see y'all skin and they'll be like, actually, we're gonna up this by 300%.
Yeah.
So definitely go with somebody who's haggling. My mom was haggling like crazy, and I was like, "Wow, this is like the Olympics." So,
oh my god,
go with somebody.
Yeah. Okay, good to know.
All right. Well, once we all vaccine, we can.
Yeah, post vaccine. We'll come to Maryland first. Say hi. And yeah. Oh, that was so. Yeah, thank you so much.
I feel literally
thank you.
So much more educated. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to like. You're so eloquent. You know what you're talking about, and you're also like inspiring and just like awesome to talk to. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
This was such an honor.
Oh my god.
Why don't you you already talked about your Twitter, but is there anywhere else that people can check you out or follow you or anything you want people to check out?
Yeah, so thanks so much again for this amazing opportunity. I am on Twitter, as I've mentioned a couple times during this podcast. It's Afronomics, and I'm also on Instagram now. So that's just my name, Anna Gifty O, and the Gifty is just like gift with the Y at the end, the letter O. And so yeah, you can just follow me on those two platforms. You can engage me. I'm pretty friendly actually. So like, just feel free to like message me. Don't hit me up with anything random or wild. I will definitely ignore that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so freaking much. And like, we're gonna have part 2 when we start to really be like, okay, economics 101 part 2, part 3, part 4, and it's all the end of time.
Like, economics for dummies. Like, we're gonna go pre-order that.
Okay. Thank
Excellent.
you.
All
Thank
right.
you.
See y'all later.
Bye.